Let's take a look at the heroes in Battlegrounds.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
That's right, the new game mode has 24 playable heroes, and knowing the right ones to pick can go a really long way towards shaping your run and helping you find those nice top fours and even the occasional victories. I'm going to run through each of these heroes, describing their strengths, their weaknesses, pointing out my favorites, and perhaps a tip here and there on how to utilize them as successfully as possible. Up first here we have AFK, and she's a pretty fun hero in that she skips her first 2 turns, but then you get a nice power spike because she gets a tier 3 and tier 4 unit when most other people are still going to be playing with like tier 2 and mostly tier 1 minions at that point. So you're going to take a little bit of damage, pretty much guaranteed, unless there's a huge mistake in your first couple rounds. But the good news is that damage doesn't really matter. It's probably only going to be for a few hit points here and there. You might go down to like 35, for instance, when you finally get back into the game with AFK. And then you get some nice units that can really help you also determine a strategy or a game plan really quickly. Your hero power won't really benefit you moving forward. It is kind of about that spike, so you want to make sure to take advantage of that, really pressure your opponents. It's, in my opinion, kind of hard to win with AFK sometimes, but she's a great card to help you get to those top 4 spots. Moving over here to Bartendotron, his hero power is that he reduces the cost of your tavern tier upgrades by 1 gold. So normally if you'd be spending 4 gold to upgrade, he's going to make it only cost 3. And maybe if it's 8 gold late in the game, it goes down to 7. And this can provide some pretty significant breakpoints along the way where that extra gold allows you to like buy a unit while still upgrading, or maybe squeeze in an extra reroll, for instance. So there are some moments in the game where this is really, really impactful. Now, there are going to be other instances in the game where it doesn't seem like this is doing much, like that extra reroll maybe that you get doesn't go that far, or the math's not lining up. And of course, there's kind of a limit on the power level of this because you can only level up so many times, right? So that's really reducing the effectiveness long-term of this hero power. It does kind of fall off, but it's another one where if you can leverage it at the right moments, gain those small power spikes, pressure your opponents, I think you can play for a top 4 spot with this hero power rather successfully. So moving on here to Dancin Darrell, probably everybody's favorite looking hero. This is a pretty complex hero power though. It's called Hat Trick, and it reads, after you sell a minion, randomly give 2 minions in Bob's Tavern +1/+1. Now, at first glance, I'll be honest, this hero power doesn't look like much to me. There isn't really that much minion selling happening in Battlegrounds for the most part. And the fact that you're randomly buffing things in the tavern means you have to be cycling through minions a lot, hitting the right targets for these buffs to really add up. And then in the late game, +1/+1's really not that significant. But Mike Dene, the guy who's really behind Battlegrounds, he's the head honcho of Battlegrounds, told me that for really skilled players, this is one of the best hero powers out there. So I guess if you can find a build that's just cycling alley cats and doing crazy stuff, perhaps, Hat Trick can go a long way. So I don't really see it on this one. I think this one's really hard to use for most people's playstyles, but apparently and potentially the sky can be the limit with this one if you're very skilled and you have a game plan to support it. Moving on here to George the Fallen, one of the most, if not the most expensive hero powers in Battlegrounds. It gives a friendly minion Divine Shield. And you might be thinking like, man, 4 gold is so much. That's like more than an entire unit. I could level up instead. And you're right that in the early to mid game, this is a very expensive hero power. But if you can get far enough to push this one towards the late game, there are so many rounds where you don't really have much to do. Maybe you're just looking for 1 unit and you're just burning through rerolls. You've already fully upgraded your tavern and your gold just kind of feels wasted. That's where Boon of Light becomes powerful because you can start turning that gold into a very valuable onboard effect because Divine Shields are fantastic in Battlegrounds. They increase the survivability of your minions, often allowing them to take multiple attacks, can really cause problems for opponents. Save this one up for those big, powerful late game minions, and it can pay off some major dividends. Moving on here to Giant Finn, Merlotte King is the hero power, and at the start of next combat, give your minions Death Rattle summon a 1/1 Merlotte. Well, if you've seen any Battlegrounds footage, you know that 1/1s just don't go very far in this game. They really need a lot of support to make any sort of sense. Big buffs when they get summoned, for instance, from cards like Mama Bear. But right now you can't do that with Murlocs. It's like Murloc War Leader giving them a little bit of damage, but that's not really enough. There's no like Scavenging Hyena to feed into either with Murloc. So in my opinion, this is probably the weakest of all the hero powers in Battlegrounds right now. In a lot of ways, this hero power doesn't scale at all. It's a super liability, and therefore I think it's an incredibly risky one to run. Next up here, we have Infinite Toki, and she's got a really cool hero power. If you use it to refresh Bob's Tavern once per turn, the last minion will be from a higher tavern tier. So basically, this just gives you a better reroll opportunity because you're going to get something that's higher than it's supposed to be, which means sometimes you don't have to level your tavern up all the way. You can still hit tier 6 units if you're looking for them, something perfect for your build just off of Infinite Tokis. And once per round, that really does start to stack up. You'll start noticing the minion quality of your composition goes up quite drastically just from 1 or 2. Particularly early in the game, this can help you find a higher tier unit to kind of set a game plan by and develop your synergy early. So I think Infinite Toki is really, really good across all points in the game, both late and early, and is certainly the sort of hero that can help you find some significant victories in Battlegrounds. Up next here, we have King Mukla that reads, whenever you sell a beast, add a banana to your hand. And that's cool. You can fill your hand with lots of bananas, which are 1/1 buffs on minions for clarity, in case you didn't know. But the problem is here, again, you gotta sell a lot of minions, which can be tough to do. I mean, alley cats and those sorts of things feed really nicely into this hero power, but builds don't always line up like that. There can be a lot of competition for beasts. Maybe you're just offered an early triple that's a mech, and then your beast plan's just gone. And there's no dividends paid for King Mukla at all. So because this is such a narrow hero power and the payoff isn't really significant enough to chase this hero power, this is another one that I think is really more of a trap and could certainly cause problems in your run. Next up here, we have Lich Baz. This is a 0 gold hero power, which is kind of cool, but still active. You will take 3 damage and add a gold coin to your hand. And the gold coin is basically a way to store up gold for future turns if you want to, right? You just get extra gold essentially, or even the same turn too. You just get 1 extra gold every time you want to hit this button once per turn. But of course, you risk killing yourself pretty rapidly if you're taking 3 damage. So there's a real risk reward here, but if you're in the lead and you know you're safe and you have the luxury of taking that damage, you can really help to secure a lead or even play from behind a little bit by accelerating your game plan using all of this extra gold. That's extra rerolls, faster level ups, an extra unit here and there, all of which mean you can gain a distinct advantage over your opponent. So people who are careful, who understand their limits, can go a really long way with this one, I think. Next up here, we have Lordjaraxxus with the 3 gold hero power that'll give your demons +1/+1. So definitely if you have a full demon board, this is a +7/+7 buff late in the game every round, which can be a great way to spend your gold. Definitely, much like we saw previously with Divine Shield, like that does start to stack up rather nicely. The downside perhaps for Jaraxxus is that you are pretty much forced into a demon build to get any value out of your hero power, which can be limiting. Sometimes things just don't line up and you need to pivot, or you just have some great beasts, so you got to go beasts and then your hero power is a little bit dead. But if you can find those amalgams or demons, then Blood Flurry can pay off when you have all that spare gold in the late game. Next up here, we have Maleficent Manastorm, and she's pretty narrowly focused on mechs in that anything you purchase in the tavern that's a mech will have +1/+1. And that's certainly very powerful in the early to mid game. Those extra stats can help you win rounds you might otherwise lose, but it doesn't scale especially well because it's not growing over time. Unlike Jaraxxus that can dump +7/+7 every turn, this is only ever going to be that initial +1/+1 for the minion when you buy it. And your board can only ever have 7 minions at a time. So max you're ever going to get on a single board value out of this is 7/7, and it's not repeatable every turn. But of course, it's also free, so you can use your gold to better refine your build. Now, I've had a lot of success with Maleficent Manastorm. I think in some reasons that's just because she's simple and she points you in a good direction. Even if the hero power doesn't pay off particularly well, it's kind of non-cluttered, which I think makes it good for those runs where you're probably not going to win, but you're happy with a top 3 or top 4. This feels like exactly the sort of hero that can provide that. Next up here, we have Nefarian with Nefarian Fire. It will deal 1 damage to all enemy minions at the start of next combat. And you might be like, what, Regis, 1 damage? I saw like 135 health minion. Who cares about 1 damage? Well, Divine Shields care. And often if you're going for the win, playing for those super late game builds, most of the best decks will have at least a handful of Divine Shield minions, making Nefarian the perfect counter. So this is a hero power that's really not going to help you much in the early to mid game. You probably don't even want to hit the button because 1 health doesn't matter when everything has 10. It's so unlikely to be relevant just because the breakpoints don't often line up. But in the late game, when Divine Shields start landing, this is the kind of thing you're going to want to hit every turn because it gives you an enormous advantage and counter to that particular style. So Nefarian is exactly the sort of hero that if you're good enough to make it to those last few rounds, he will give you a great advantage and can definitely play for the win. Next up here we have Patches the Pirate, another activatable effect here for 1 gold, but this one only deals 3 damage to 2 random enemy minions at the start of next combat. So in some ways similar to Nefarian, right? It's like, oh, okay, that's about the same amount of damage as Nefarian. But, of course, it's only 2 targets, so it's not that universal Divine Shield cleaner that Nefarian is. It could theoretically pop a couple Divine Shields in the late game, but this one's much more designed for the early game, picking off a couple of your opponent's minions, nabbing those early victories. But here's the thing, right? In the early game, damage doesn't really add up all that fast, and there's no reward in regards to resources for killing or winning in those early rounds. So essentially, things that focus on the early game just don't scale that well, and they're not likely to give you the kinds of things you need to play towards the late game and play for those victories. So will this save you a few health points here and there? Absolutely it will, because you'll win a few extra rounds. It might gain you a spot or 2 throughout the course of the game, but it's not the sort of thing you want to play for the win, and I think this is really one of the weaker hero power options. Next up here we have Patchwork, who has 60 health instead of 40. That's it for this one. And I actually think this is a really cool hero power. It just gives you so much more time to plan a strategy, to take things carefully, to make good decisions, to play for the right kinds of stuff, that I think it doesn't feel like it's an active effect, but in reality it has very big results over the course of a game as long as you utilize it correctly. So in some ways this feels like kind of a simple choice for players who don't really know how to use their hero powers, and that's true. I think it's really good for beginners, but I also think Patchwork's really good for advanced players too, who are able to use that time and that careful planning to do something amazing with their build that would otherwise be impossible. Next up here is Professor Putricide with Rage Potion, which at the start of next combat will give your leftmost minion plus 10 attack. And I can confirm, this used to give your leftmost minion poisonous, which could do all kinds of shenanigans. I think it cost a little more as well to help balance that. But Blizzard saw apparently the threat there and reduced this to 10 attack, which is still pretty nifty, particularly in the early game. That can help you trade into some really big stuff. But even in the late game, 10 is like significant enough to still be worth 1 gold in most cases, particularly if you can put this on like a cleave style minion so that it's hitting multiple things, even Divine Shield minions to help them take better trades. It's going to be worth 1 gold in most cases unless you really know what your opponent's going to have and somehow it just doesn't work out. Big crazy taunts or whatever it might be. So I think this is one of those hero powers that's never absolutely amazing. It's not going to blow your mind, but it's consistent and reliable throughout multiple portions of the game, which make it an absolutely fine, safe sort of choice. And then here with a similar kind of hero power, but in the other direction, we have Pyramid that will give a random friendly minion plus 2 health. And in the scheme of things, this really doesn't go very far. Not to mention the case that this is a random friendly minion, so it may not even hit the targets you care about giving extra survivability to. It doesn't have any risks, it's very simple, but it's just not very good, and it's going to be hard to go far with this one. Queen Wag Toggle here, another active hero power at 1 gold. It'll give a friendly mech, demon, murloc, and beast 1 health. So a little bit more controllable than Pyramid, and a little bit bigger too, because you can technically get a total of plus 4 health here from Queen Wag Toggle's effect. So it can do things with amalgam builds and actually just kind of like multi-synergy builds. We've got a handful of different things out there. Those are both great for this, but ultimately it's the same problem. Health just doesn't go that far, and it doesn't impact the game that much. And not to mention, like, you're investing in minions sometimes that you just end up selling later. So you might waste this gold in the long run anyway. It's just paying off for a round or two. Then you upgrade and you start the journey all over again. So unfortunately, I don't think this scales well. Starts to pay too high a price, therefore meaning she's a pretty weak hero. Next up here is Ragnaros the Fire Lord, 2 gold this time, and Rag will deal 8 damage to 2 random enemy minions. So a little bit similar to Patches here, but scaled up in cost and scaled up in damage. And obviously this can just wreak havoc on mid-game boards, like it can ruin people by killing like 2 of their best minions if it hits well. But much like Patches, 8 damage just doesn't scale that well into the late game. It doesn't deal with Divine Shields very effectively, which means Ragnaros falls off pretty hard and this hero power kind of dies later in the game, which I think is a bit of a problem because early and mid-game, you just don't do enough. You don't make a big enough impact or swing the game hard enough. And that means that this one, although super fun because you're Ragnaros, really doesn't end up feeling all that strong. Next up here, we have Shudder Walk, which will allow your next battle cry in a given turn to trigger twice. And you might be thinking, battle cry, what? That's not a thing that you do. But you do have battle cries, obviously, in Battlegrounds. There's always those Defender of Argus and Cold Light Seer style minions. And if you use your Shudder Walk in a strategic way, you can get some pretty big payoffs. Think about like Gentle Megasaur, for instance. This is insane. You can give all of your Murlocs Divine Shield and Poisonous all at the same time. And that's crazy. And I've seen Shudder Walk create some absolutely run-winning builds all by himself. I think good players can really make a lot out of Shudder Walk, and therefore, theoretically, a very high skill level character that can win runs. Next up here, we have the Curator, who starts the game with a 1/1 Amalgam. And I know that doesn't sound like much, because it's just a 1/1. And that certainly doesn't sound like it scales very well over the course of the game. But I'm always pleasantly surprised by just how much that leads to success in Battlegrounds, because having that amalgam means no matter which direction you go in the early game, you can really start to stack the value onto that amalgam. And by the late game, it's just going to be some enormous threat. It's going to have Poisonous from Toxfend. It's going to have all these like magnetic plays with Divine Shields and Death Rattles. And it gives you a lot of flexibility for how to build out your strategy in the early game. But it also, frankly, just gives you a strategy in its amalgam nature, and it just gives you this really consistent, enormous sort of threat. So it doesn't look like much, but I actually really like this hero power, and I think it can play for some great results in runs if you let it and you understand how to utilize it. So this one's pretty good. Next up here, we have the great Akazam Zarak. He has a 2 gold hero power that allows you to discover a secret and put it into the battlefield. Now, I don't know all of the things in the secret pool right now. It's changed a little bit over time, but I do know certain things like splitting image, for instance, which can be great because it'll create copies of awesome, gigantic minions with like divine shields and taunts. That's fantastic. So I will say that of all the games I've played of Battlegrounds so far, this guy kept playing for like the top 2 or 3 spots very consistently. I don't have enough data yet to say that was anything but coincidence, but it sure feels like something's working very well here with Akazam Zarak, and it can shock your opponents. Not that there's much that you have to play around because battles are resolving automatically, but can give you time, can give you resources, a repeatable effect here that does kind of scale with your build into the late game, all of which make this seem like a really good option. Next up here, we have the Lich King with Reborn Rights, which at the start of the next combat will give your rightmost minion Reborn. And you might think, oh, just 1 extra Death Rattle. Is that really that big of a deal? Death Rattle, right? But it can be, because in Battlegrounds, there are often really high value sorts of things that you're trying to protect that are often at the right side of your board because you want them to attack last. Think about like a Khadgar, for instance, that's summoning you multiple copies of minions. Super high valuable asset, but maybe it gets sniped early by something your opponent did. Maybe they've got, some good luck or a zap that's going to snipe it. And in that case, giving it Reborn can make sure that it comes back and presents the same threat that it would have originally. So you're kind of protecting yourself against losing your key asset. And that's actually a really powerful effect that can absolutely win rounds, save games and play very well both early, because you get just extra stats on board, but also late because of those synergies. So I think Lich King's really, really strong despite the singular minion impact here, and this offers a great choice. Next up here we have the Rat King, which has 4 hero powers, but essentially they all do the same thing just for a different tribe or race in Hearthstone. And that's whenever you buy something of a certain race on a given turn, it'll give it +1/+2. So pretty significant buff, but you gotta buy Murlocs on the right turn, you gotta buy Demons on the right turn, you gotta buy Mechs on the right turn. And I have to say, this is very hard to work smoothly. It can be very impactful in the early game because +1/+2 goes a long way for the first 4 or 5 turns of the game, where those stats can get you a win that would otherwise be impossible. But then it just becomes a headache to manage. It's more about luck and just happening to find the right things. Maybe you play into a beast-only build and you're only getting an impact off your hero power like every 1 in 4 turns. That doesn't feel very good. So for me, the Rat King is far more awkward than high utility. And although this hero power is fine because it occasionally chips in some extra stats, it really doesn't go very far and it doesn't scale very well. So overall, pretty weak choice. Moving on to Trade Prince Gallywix, he will add a gold coin to your hand at the cost of 1 gold. Which you might say, wait a minute, what? Why is he doing that? Well, it allows you to bank your gold for the future. You can stock up a hand full of gold. So for instance, if you don't want to re-roll a bunch right now, you want to wait till you tier up to the max tier, and then you want to re-roll to your heart's content to find and buy exactly the right synergy minion, Trade Prince Gallywix can allow you to do that. So making an investment for the future can pay off if you're able to use it successfully and kind of know what you're looking for. Now, I think this is a pretty high skill cap character. Can be easy to fall into mistakes and traps here with this one. But for people who know how to use this well, I suspect Gallywix can actually pay off quite a bit and lead to some great runs. And then finally here we have Yaks Hope's End, which for 2 gold will hire you a random minion in Bob's Tavern and give it +1/+1. So a couple things happening there with that hero power. Namely, you're getting a stat buff, which is nice. +1/+1's fine. But also you're getting a discount on a minion every time you make a purchase, because normally they cost 3 gold, and in this case, they only cost 2 gold. So this can allow you to be very efficient at the cost of choice, because you're getting random stuff instead. But I think this is really cool in the early game because it does just kind of like, okay, let's see what we get. We're going to open the box. Okay, we got a Murloc, so now we're going to play for a Murloc build. Okay, we got a Mech, so now we play for Mechs. Now, that can be limiting, right? Because maybe you don't want to hit the button in the future. It's going to be hard. But, you know, through the mid-game, this is really nice. But, of course, consistency is a real issue here. Hitting stuff you don't want. Then you're selling it back for 1 gold, and you spend a gold to just kind of take a chance. That doesn't feel quite as good. So, interesting in the early and mid. Kind of intriguing in the late game, but probably not worth the risk. So, ultimately, a hero that's fun, crazy, has the potential to go nuts if everything lines up, but more often than not, the risk will not be worth the reward. So there you go, folks. Those are each of the heroes currently in Battlegrounds. I am going to do a video in the future where I maybe talk about my top 5. I think we need to see the meta in action a little bit, see which things really feel the best as we get some more games under our belts. This was more of a descriptive introduction, give you some ideas, give you some tips, as opposed to really giving you a top tier list sort of choice. That's going to come down the road a little bit, but hopefully this was still valuable. You learned a little bit about each of these heroes, and you're going to be a little better equipped heading into the Battlegrounds either right now or very soon, so that you can get a leg up on your opponents early on in the Battlegrounds meta. That said, if you have any interpretations that are different than mine, please feel free to share those. We can all learn from one another as long as we're civil and intelligent in the comments below, and I trust you guys to be exactly that. So leave some great thoughts down there. But until then, thanks very much for watching, and until next time, game on.
Dragons take flight above the ice and snow.